Well, Ireland, like in the certainly coming up through the seventies and eighties, there was a few bands in Ireland, but mostly the Irish scene emigrated to the UK. You know, I think the Boomtown Rats or Tin Lizzy even before them, whatever. That there wasn't really there wasn't really a scene in Dublin per se, and that actually was one of the things that made me want to move to Edinburgh, move to the UK. I didn't really want to move to London, but the quality of bands in the UK was much higher because of that, because there were stages to play on. Like, I mean, Ireland was still quite constricted, but also, the folk scene was there. A lot of the people who kind of played with us also were trad musicians. The band Keela out of Dublin, now pretty successful Irish trad music, modern trad music, but all of those were part of the street busking scene as well. It was very much, it was just about music. There wasn't really tribes in the same way. Dublin was quite small, so really in my lifetime, Dublin went from, like the way I used to describe the 70s, it was like Dublin was like a depressed Middlesbrough or something. Do you know what I mean? It was a small, really felt like a regional, small town somewhere, an offshoot of England. Now, it very much had the Irish personality to it, but in terms of economic positioning and in terms of even world profile, it was a very, very small place. But then what that gave us was the musicians all knew each other, and we all were able to then support each other. We all shared gear, for example, for a long time. But the weakness in that was then there was a lot of musicians, so it was very easy to put a band together, but not a lot of really good musicians because there wasn't a way to grow. If one or two people, if you got one good musician in the band, they wouldn't find it difficult to get four people around them. But then there was nothing to do with it. So you didn't really kind of go, well, we need the best drummer in town and we need the best bass player, because there was no way of judging that. And I think when we moved to Edinburgh, and particularly seeing how bands like We Free Kings viewed their opportunity and their way of being able to progress, it was a natural move for us. Dublin is so much better now. Ireland in general has a very, very healthy music scene. But it wasn't so strong then. Edinburgh seemed, even though it was remote, Edinburgh seemed like there was a lot more opportunity to get better there, and it proved to be true.
And I met Vincent through the Waterboys and We Free Kings. We Free Kings were a local band in Edinburgh. I had worked at a pop music paper called Cut, which was down in Stockbridge in 87, 88, and 89. And I met We Free Kings, and they were affiliated to the Waterboys because the lead singer of We Free Kings, Joe Kingman, used to share a flat with Mike Scott in Edinburgh during their university days. And I met Vincent because Mike Scott then moved to Ireland to be near Steve Wickham, who was the fiddle player in the Waterboys. We were kind of on the fringes of that whole scene. And the Waterboys came and did a charity gig in Edinburgh for an AIDS benefit gig with Jimmy Somerville, and I can't remember, countless other musicians that were in it. Sheila was the violin player and Vincent was the guitarist and the songwriter in Pure Blind Panic. They used to busk together in Dublin, and they used to have a huge scene, music scene of fantastic musicians. Kenny and We Free Kings also, the drummer used to play for We Free Kings, and they all came up through that busking tradition, and they used to all busk on Grafton Street or Edinburgh, whatever. And Vincent and Sheila used to bust Waterboy songs. So that's how the whole thing started. We were very much a cottage industry, so we had a little scene going with We Free Kings, Archbishop Kebab, Pure Blind Panic, and another band called The Spark, who then became the Albie Singers. And so we were all based in Edinburgh. We had our own little sound man, our own little lights man, and the whole people used to make T-shirts and everything for us. They used to make posters for us, and we used to put on gigs in the venue through George Duffin. We would get the occasional gig supporting bands like the American Music Club or LaRue, who were a kind of swamp, bluegrass, sort of swamp band from somewhere in America. But we would get occasional support gigs, but more often than not, we would put on our own gigs in the venue. We would hire out the venue for the night, and we put on 3 or 4 bands like We Free Kings, Dunderfunk, Lost Soul Band, kith and kin or whoever, and we'd go and fly post, and we make our own posters and our own tickets, and we charge a fiver, and everybody would come.
There was a lot of good free festivals happening then as well. They were always very good fun to play. I remember playing Scorrig. I think we were lucky as a band because we knew the Kelty PA crew, the Jam PA, so we knew them right from the earliest days, and they were fantastic support. I mean, both Michael O'Donnell, who's no longer with us, and Michael Brennan toured with us. And, you know, they were very, very significant in it. And I think, you know, Jim and Michael were really, really good mentors around them. I mean, you mentioned support acts. I remember I think our second ever gig was in the Rock Club in Kelty, and we were supporting LaRue, a band called LaRue, who were French-Canadian kind of Cajun stompy stuff. They were a good band for us. But I remember Jim introduced us to them as the opening act, not the support band. And that was a big lesson. It was a big lesson. It was like very much, no, you're here to make the night. It's overall the night makes something. And even, you know, ourselves in Pure Blind Panic, we always thought of bands. Whenever we were playing small place and a smaller band would be with us, that was something that really stuck. And it seems so small and insignificant, but actually it was a big lesson in how to be mature about what you're doing. This is serious, you know what I mean? It was a good lesson, and yeah, it was an interesting time. Certainly up around Fife, I thought there was a lot of good stuff happening. Those guys were miners, and during the miners' strike, they, you know, when they got let go, they pulled together, bought a PA, and started working with bands. But kind of more important than that, they trained about 15 or 20 young fellas from Kelty, like all because they had kids coming up. You know, the bands that they would tour with would come to the Rock Store or come to the Rock Club in Kelty and do their warm-up gig there, always undercover. It was, you know, so they do their warm-up gig there. But what they did was they actually used that as a training ground then for all of the younger guys coming through. Like Jim's nephew, Michael Brennan, ended up working with The Cure, still is touring at a very, very high level now. So I think that as much as they helped us out, I think that there's a lot of professional touring crew now that come from Kelty that owe their start to those people. And I think that, you know, when Jim became a councillor, it was no surprise. Edinburgh was a bit more difficult in terms of it was kind of sewn up. There was the bands from before, the shop assistants and those type of bands, and there was the whole Oriel kind of thing, and very similar to Dublin. There was bands who made a certain point. I think what was interesting around the time we were there is that same thing. We realised you could book the venue on a Tuesday night, and I remember, for example, we were playing around town, and we maybe had an audience 40, 50, 60 people like that, doing the odd little session here and there. We didn't play loads of gigs at that time because we wanted to tour, not just do random gigs. There was another band in Edinburgh at the time called the Lost Soul Band, who were about the same at the same point, and we did a couple of gigs together where we kind of went. I think like the first time we did put on our own gig, the two bands got together and we booked the venue, and then we knew we'd pull 100 and we were able to pull 200, and suddenly both bands start working. Do you know what I mean? So I think that sort of thing started happening in Edinburgh around that time. There became opportunities for that, and I think, you know, certainly that was a fertile way of looking at stuff for a while. It certainly it meant that you got to play on the bigger stages, that they wouldn't give you a gig supporting anybody coming from down south, for example. Do you know what I mean? It just wasn't worth it to them.
We got a couple of really great gigs. Like, for example, I was friends through my pop music paper cut before I started the band. I became really good friends with quite a few sort of people, like a writer for the paper and a photographer for the paper and a sculptor through the paper. and also Goodbye Mr. Mackenzie through the paper. So we got a couple of really fantastic gigs through the Mackenzies. We played at the Queen's Hall in Edinburgh and the Ritz in Aberdeen and a few other places. But we also had the sculptor. He gave us, he had a gallery down the bottom of Broughton Street. So we did a lot of photography there. And we also had a fantastic photographer who ended up working in serious music like for Bjork and David Bowie and Edwyn Collins and whoever, called Gavin Evans, who I met through Cut, and he lived 2 doors down from us when we lived in Claremont Crescent in Edinburgh, and he took all our photographs.
I have a great memory. Well, actually, I have 2 memories from it. The Levellers played that night as well, and I found myself. This was probably the first real festival we played, where we were on the bill rather than in a tent in the corner, kind of somewhere, you know. And I remember, first of all, kind of going, wow, we just supported Rory Gallagher. Do you know what I mean? That was just like mind blowing. And I even wasn't particularly a Rory Gallagher fan at the time, but it was still awesome to have done that, you know. But I remember finding myself backstage. There was no hash or weed to be had anywhere at the Fla. It was a really disaster. And all the bands like that, I remember the Levellers from stage offering a crate of beer from the rider if anyone could bring them a quarter of hash. Do you know what I mean? It was just like crazy. And I found myself at one stage backstage with Van Morrison, who's a wee little guy, and the fiddle player from the Levellers, who's about 7 foot tall. And I was standing in between the two of them, 3 of us having this weird conversation. That was quite unusual. My biggest memory of that day, though, was it was an amazing lineup, and it was, you know, the Fla concept had come from Ireland. There had already been the what are they called? The promoters, and I can't think of the name escapes me at the moment, had already run a couple of Flas. So they'd done, I think, one in London and I think one in Scotland as well. The lineup was exceptional at that time, I think. And also, it was a little bit before festivals became as not commercialised is the wrong word, but as formalised as they are now. You know, it seemed much more random and like you were at a huge party, really, you know, with no weed.
It was amazing. I was so nervous going on that. I remember it very vividly. I was wearing an emerald green sort of suede jacket, and I'm standing on the edge at the back of the stage with my funny my hair and my plaits and everything. And I think we were quite early on, and it was the main stage. It was the same stage as Delamitri and Van Morrison, and I was just like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And we just went on and we just let rip, and it was absolutely fantastic. And we got a great response, and we spent the whole day there, and we just sort of wandered about, and you could wander around backstage and go and stand at the side of the stage and watch everybody else play. I can't remember, I don't think the weather was particularly good, but the day was really good. And I went to see the Levellers as well, yeah, because they were really big. Because we started off as a sort of trash country band with all acoustic instruments, and then we decided we were going electric. So the Levellers kind of, yeah, they were very much from our kind of eco-warrior kind of country scene. Shirley Manson's probably the big trailblazer from Edinburgh for me. I grew up with her when I was at Cut Music Paper. She's now in Garbage. But she started out in Goodbye Mr. Mackenzie, and she was a real trailblazer. She was a red-haired, feisty, fiery woman, and I thought she was absolutely fabulous. But there was also the girl from Archbishop Kebab, Karen. She was a really strong woman as well. So, and polystyrene from X-Ray Specs and all that kind of thing. I was really into all that kind of thing. You know, so the punk aspect as well, the kind of doing it yourself, and to hell what people think, just get up and do it. So that really kind of appealed to me as well.
So what happened initially was, so there was the band the Hothouse Flowers, who were reasonably successful, and then, like you mentioned, Liam and Faulkner from that had a little busking act called the Benzini Brothers. So basically what it was an acoustic act that they could put on at cabaret shows or they could do gigs, but they also used to busk. And myself and a guy, one of my longest mates, a guy called Echo, we decided 16 or 15, let's go and give this a go, you know. So we'd about 4, 5 songs, and we went in, gave it a go, and we kind of went, okay, let's do that again. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, we met a guy, Mark Dignam, who was doing the same thing, same age. He decided over that summer, I'm going to give this busking thing a go. So we started hanging out, and he introduced us to 2 other guys, one of which was Glenn Hansard, who lived down the road from him, and the other was a guy called Mick Christopher, who died pretty tragically a few years ago. But they were fantastic musicians. So the 5 of us then start busking together. And the main, there's a pedestrian street now in Dublin called Grafton Street, but it used to have cars on it at the time, but it was a very busy shopping street. And we just used to go out after school or on a Saturday afternoon, we'd go into town, busk, buy beer with the money we made, you know. But slowly then, as I was saying, there's loads of musicians in Ireland, you know, and loads of people who played not because they go out to lessons or they learned in school, but because their family played. So, you know, someone would walk by with a fiddle and we go, oh, can you play? They'd stop and watch me, can you play? And we go, yeah, jump in. So slowly we start building a scene around us like that. And, you know, and then it started having that there would be different pockets of us around town. We all hung out together, we all hung out in the same coffee shop. And depending on who was in, you'd step in, or maybe if there's too many of us, we'd go and we'd set up 2 pitches or whatever. And we just shuffled around. But there was the core of the 5 of us, I think. And then over that summer, that just became a youth thing, a youth movement. So all of these, we ended up sometimes with 30 of us playing together. We do sponsored busks for the homeless charities. And we go out and 30 of us would get together and we'd set up on the street. And it really became popular then. You know, like we'd often have audiences of 300-400 people watching us. And, you know, it really became, out of that then, maybe 6 or 8 bands formed that became the cornerstone of that Dublin music scene. So you got, you know, you'd have had the likes of the Frames and Keela, ourselves, the Mary Janes, for example. And then that brought out a whole new generation. So this would have been before I moved to Edinburgh. So around the time I moved to Edinburgh, it had kind of transcended now, and there was kids coming through. We were now, say, 20 or 21, and there was kids coming through who were 16 or 17, had been on the fringes and were now moving into things, and we were starting to move off into doing gigs. But it's kind of interesting, even like now, that whole thing is a huge marketing piece of what Dublin is. But interestingly enough, if you go in and you go down Grafton Street sometimes, there's still kids who are singing the versions of songs that we arranged for that busking thing. Like some of it has trickled down. And it's kind of interesting as people got more and more famous and were touring. Every Christmas Eve for the last 10 or 12 years, we all get together and we had a Christmas busk on Grafton Street on Christmas Eve as a charity thing for Simon. And, you know, that started 10 years ago and we would just have a hat out. But the likes of Glenn would come, or the likes of Paddy Casey or Damien Rice, all of these people who they'd all come out and busk with us. And then about 5 years ago, Bono started coming in for the Christmas busk. So for the last few years, like 2 years ago or 3 years ago, they had to take it. We started building a low stage, and then we had to start having security because there'd be like Sinead O'Connor would come and do songs. It was a really interesting time, and it became a known thing in Dublin. So, like for the last 3 or 4 years, on Christmas Eve, maybe 5,000 people are in the audience. They've set up a stage outside one of the big theatres, the Gaiety Theatre, and now it's now a gig. Whereas before it was literally just because everyone would be back off tour for Christmas, it'd be the one time either there at say or at Electric Picnic Festival would be the only time you get to see everybody in one place.